Good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, on this marvellous sunny evening in Edinburgh. And please, if you haven't already taken your jacket off, take your jacket off. I'm going to take my jacket off now. For those of you who don't know, I'm the President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, John Arbuthnot. There are some housekeeping notes that we should take note of. First of all, that we're not expecting any alarms, and therefore if there is one, then you exit as directed through the exit doors and straight out the reception hall and across the road to the George Hotel, which has a very large bar. Secondly, would you please switch your mobile devices off because they do interfere with what we're doing in relation to filming and recording the events. And just to say that this event is being filmed and recorded, and as is the discussion, and that will then go onto our website very, very shortly. All the events that we've had on this theme of the referendum and independence have been done that way, and you can see them on the website if you go into it. And it is a full account of the previous debates. This is actually the fourth of these debates which we're having. We're doing them to some extent in collaboration with the British Academy in London. We're actually going to repeat the main events which have been held at the British Academy because they carry out their events under Chatham House rules, and there is, I think there's a vibrancy that comes from the debates up here which are completely open, which we're going to ensure happens with these topics. If you haven't already signed up for forthcoming events, I would advise you to do it because, as you can see, these are really pretty busy events, and there will be people who are watching in the overflow as well as in this main hall. And of course the issue of Scottish independence and the forthcoming referendum is one of the biggest constitutional issues that we have faced for probably centuries. And the purpose here is not to influence the political debate, but to rehearse all, as we can see, the major issues which lie before us on a what-if basis. What if we see devolution coming in as already approved, a more extended form of devolution, which many of the parties are now talking about, or full independence as a result of the referendum. And it's that issue of what if, what are the issues behind the changes that might happen in this country and to its economy. It's very special, especially important tonight because this debate is about the economy. You should have, if you had an opportunity in the reception hall before you come in, there is a table that has got the printed versions of the previous debates which have been held, and I do recommend these because they are full accounts of what has gone before. And we have 4 speakers, as you can see. We're very grateful to Douglas Fraser, our chairman for the evening. The last event here was about defence, and it was chaired by quite a major general, and he timed these events digitally to a fraction of a second, and if the speakers overran, then they were faced with some dreadful consequence. And Douglas has said he's not going to do that tonight, so it's going to be very loose. But when that's all over, then we will have the questions and answer session. And over to you, Douglas, to take it from here. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much indeed, Sir John. Welcome to you in this hall and in the overflow room as well. I'm very glad, Sir John, that we've established early on the location of the nearest large bar. That's could turn out to be important to us. As with the military, the BBC does also time things to the second, but I am not a trained killer, nor do I have any weapons at my disposal. But we will try to stick to a limited time each. I'm looking forward very much to an interesting debate led by interesting people and with interesting contributions from yourselves after they have all spoken. This is about the notion of a real economy in the context of the constitutional debate. And the notion of a real economy is quite a provocative one. At the height of the financial crisis, there was much talk, I remember, of the banks being in contrast with the real economy. But for many Scots who rely on banks, and indeed for many who work in banks, of course, that the banks were all too real. Banks are in the real economy. The real economy can also be a bit of a generalisation when you consider how diverse the Scottish economy is, how much of it is tied into the public sector and public spending, and how divergent it can be. For instance, the role of Aberdeen in the offshore oil and gas sector has become remarkably divergent from the mainstream in Scotland. Our title provokes our contributors to examine whether the political and constitutional debate is real from an economic point of view. Is constitutional change a necessary condition of getting recovery into the economy? Or is the debate perhaps a distraction from the challenge of getting the economy moving again? I'll offer up two more questions. Are we confident that any layer of government, any location of governmental powers would be the right place to drive economic growth in the real economy? Is government capable of driving growth at all? And with or without independence, is the strength of the Social Democrat consensus that we've got in Scotland, is that a good or a bad thing for the real economy? Now, coming from the BBC, of course, I'm not allowed to have any opinions on any of that sort of thing. Happily, there are people here who I'm sure won't sit on the fence. I'll introduce them to you first, and you can hear from them. We will hear from Stephen Boyd, Assistant Secretary at the Scottish Trades Union Congress, covering a wide range of its economic interests, and one of the main contacts between the unions and the Scottish Government, where he used to work as a policy officer. He's now in a range of public sector advisory boards across aerospace, energy, procurement and regulation. Professor Gordon Hughes was Professor of Economics here in Edinburgh, at Edinburgh University, followed by 10 years as an energy and environment policy advisor at the World Bank in Washington. He's now an advisor to various bodies and regulatory economic and environmental policies. We'll hear from Professor Jeremy Peat. Now, he's got quite a long curriculum vitae, the highlights including Chief Economic Advisor at the Royal Bank of Scotland for 12 interesting years, and now including membership of the Competition Commission, and he's a Director of Scottish Enterprise, plus being the Director of the David Hume Institute, carrying out its own debates on similar subjects. He's also the Chief Trustee of the pandas at Edinburgh's Zoo, among other species. The last shall be first, however. Brandon Malone is a solicitor advocate, specialising in arbitration, specialising even more in energy arbitration. He's a member of the Law Society of Scotland's Constitutional Subcommittee, and he is an enthusiastic supporter of cinema, notably at Edinburgh's Film Festival. He was at the opening gala last night, and he's missing out tonight on a film about Piper Alpha. So the challenge here, starting with you, Brandon, is to enlighten us. What has the constitutional debate got to do with the real economy?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Douglas. I should say that, to be clear, I am appearing in a personal capacity this evening, and my views are not necessarily those of any of the organisations I'm associated with. I am a lawyer. You might think that it would be obvious to a lawyer, and a lawyer could see the opportunities for business in the real economy in the creation of a new country, because there'll be a bit of paperwork, if nothing else. But you'd be amazed. Anyway, it's right to say that there are many factors to take into account when considering the question of Scottish independence. Many people will make their minds up on the referendum on purely emotional grounds, on cultural grounds, on points of principle. Some will vote for independence regardless of whether they think they'll be better off, whether they think their neighbours will be better off, and some will vote no even if they think that Scotland would prosper as an independent country. And these, in my view, are perfectly valid views to hold, perfectly valid opinions to hold. The question of whether to vote yes or no for independence is not an accounting exercise. However, in the context of a debate focused on business and the economy, the real economy, it's appropriate to disregard, I think, these soft issues for the moment and to approach the decision on independence in the same way that one would consider any business decision. And therefore, I want to look at the business case for independence. Much of the debate around the independence referendum to date has centred on risk. And we're constantly hearing about risk and uncertainty, the uncertainties of independence, the risk to our competitiveness, to our pensions, to our membership of the European Union, for example. As someone in business, I'm always a little bemused by this emphasis, because normally in business we tend to associate risk with reward. And indeed, the very essence of business, I think, is taking calculated risks for advantage. So today I want to acknowledge that there are risks, obviously, in opting for independence, just as there are risks in staying part of the Union. Of course there are risks. The question is whether the rewards outweigh these risks. It seems to me that there are many ways in which independence could provide opportunities to business in the real economy, and perhaps the most obvious is that independence would allow the Scottish Government to use the new fiscal levers which would come with independence to boost the economy and to make Scotland as attractive a place as possible to carry on business, to locate, to invest. However, tax is not the focus of this debate, and I propose instead to look at the wider picture of selling Scottish goods and services and to consider three areas: branding, public relations and promotion. First, branding. In business terms, the brand architecture, to use a term of art, of the UK, I would say is confusing to foreign markets. UK, GB, Britain, Scotland, England, Ireland, Wales, many terms are used, often trying to sell the same product. It seems to me that the UK and Britain as brands, correlating as they do to the actual international entity, the international personality that is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, gets most of the recognition, the brand recognition, if you like, at international level. And the perception of Scotland as an identifiable entity suffers as a consequence. And to put that in sort of corporate terms, the UK is not a Unilever, a holding company sitting behind Domestos and Radox and Marmite. Scotland is very much subsumed by brand UK, which is actively marketed in its own right. And there is brand confusion, I submit, between Britain, Scotland and other parts of the UK, which all have their own distinct brand attributes and value propositions. Now, that all might sound a little glib, but to give it some context, when I travel around the world promoting Scotland as a destination for arbitration, promoting Scottish legal services, in particular, and more often than not, the first part of any conversation I have with someone from out with the UK is, there is this place called Scotland. We have our own legal system, and I then have to explain to them how it differs from the English legal system. Interestingly, very interestingly, since the independence debate started, less and less you have to explain that there is a place called Scotland. You still have to explain the particular characteristics, but the independence debate itself is raising awareness of Scotland in the minds of business people around the world. But there's still, I think, a lack of awareness of what Scotland is. And only independence can truly cure that. I did go to school for a number of years in rural Florida, and I had a good 6 years experience of people asking me to explain the concept of what Scotland was, where it was it just outside London, was it in Europe, and more or less every day being asked to demonstrate my accent. But I'm sure that that's not the case for all the schools in America. It's perhaps just the one where I was. But I think increasingly, as I say, there is this awareness of what Scotland is in the world, but it's only with statehood a flag outside the UN, a place at the top table, is that really cured properly? Now, I move on to public relations. There's little doubt in my mind that Scotland's public relations suffer from being part of the United Kingdom. Scotland could and should have a positive relationship with Europe. Instead, what we are faced with is an in-out referendum on Europe. Will that come to pass? I don't know. It's hard to tell. But I saw a YouGov poll published today or yesterday, I saw it reported today, which has the Conservatives on 32%, Labour on 38%, and UKIP on 13%. Now, I'm not an accountant, but Conservatives and UKIP together, if there is this consensus in favour of a referendum, that's a possible way things might go. Are we more pro-European in Scotland? We can't say that with any certainty, but what we can say objectively is that UKIP have not yet made any progress in Scotland in terms of getting anyone elected, and certainly the Scottish Government is very pro-European, and of course it has a majority in the Scottish Parliament with a pro-European policy. But in the meantime, on Europe, on Iraq, on Afghanistan in general, the foreign policy of the UK is Scotland's foreign policy. It is Scotland's PR. You might agree with these policies, you might not. But the point is that the perception of Scotland is coloured by UK foreign policy, and as regards Europe in particular, I submit that's bad for business, bad for the economy. And finally, I want to look at promotion. How is Scotland promoted abroad? And just as importantly, how is the UK promoted abroad? And this, of course, varies from industry to industry, and I can only speak with any authority in respect of my own field, professional services. At the UK level, professional services are promoted by UKTI, the Foreign Commonwealth Office, and also in conjunction with a body called City UK, which is a private membership organisation. Now, back in 2011, the Chancellor, George Osborne, launched the UK government's Plan for Growth, which was a plan to get the UK economy back on track. The document contained the following line: as part of government efforts to promote UK legal services internationally, the government will also work to protect the supremacy of English contract law. Now, as a Scottish lawyer, that rankled a little bit because, well, Scots law is different, and we, of course, in Scotland like to think that Scots law is supreme, but there you go. There was a follow-up document, the Plan for Growth, promoting UK legal services, the UK legal services sector, but again, that devoted only a sentence to Scotland and continued to conflate this notion of UK law with English law. So again, we have this brand confusion, if you like, this conflation of UK and frankly, London with the legal scene. But in fairness, through the Scottish Arbitration Centre, we engaged with UK government to see about getting a proper mention for Scotland in this plan that was purporting to promote UK legal services in the whole. And I have to say that the Scotland Office and the Office of the Advocate General were very responsive to this approach, and I would have to say that David Mundell in particular and Lord Wallace of Tankerness were very helpful, and that there's now a revised document and the revised Plan for Growth, which was launched this year by the Lord Chancellor and then again in Scotland. And they made specific reference to the Scottish legal system, to the Scottish Arbitration Centre, and to Scotland's particular expertise in energy law. And that, of course, is very welcome. But even this revised document is still heavily focused on London, on English arbitration, and the English legal system. And this is hardly surprising. And on one view, you can't blame the UK government for promoting English lawyers over Scots lawyers. I suppose it's kind of the West Lothian question in reverse. They are down there in London. I think it was Spock in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, who said, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. I think he may have been paraphrasing Jeremy Bentham, who observed it's the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. And yes, you have to see, it's the old expression perhaps that we're in bed with an elephant. There are many, many, many times the lawyers in England that we have in Scotland. So, in conclusion, brand confusion, bad PR, and mixed messages in our promotion, these are all factors negated by independence. This is where the opportunity for business sits, the opportunity for a clear, focused and instantly recognisable Scottish brand, the opportunity to control our own public relations, the perception and reputation of Scotland in the world, and the opportunity to have a single promotional message that showcases Scottish business with clarity and focus, without caveats and without qualification. Independence offers a direct, unfiltered channel to the world. It offers us a world capital here in Edinburgh, with all of the energy and profile that a world capital attracts. This is an opportunity for Scottish business, a world of opportunity which could be here on our doorsteps. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Brandon. Lots of questions may flow from that, but you're not going to get your chance to ask them just yet, not until you've heard, first of all, from Stephen Boyd.
Thank you, Douglas, and thanks to the RSE for the invite to speak to you this evening. Things I've learned in the last few seconds is I'm no longer able to read Arial 14 point without my glasses, so excuse me a minute if I get them on. I should start by saying that, unlike Brandon, I don't really do personal capacity. I don't get away with it, so I'm kind of speaking here tonight as an STUC speaker. And I would have to alert you to the fact that we are a large and democratic organisation who are still working through our position in regards to the Constitution. So at some point this evening, someone may well ask me a very good question that I'm not able to answer, or at least I might be very constrained in how I answer it, so I'll alert you to that at the beginning. I'm also going to be boringly single issue tonight. I was asked to speak about the labour market, which I'm delighted to do, but I'm going to stick to that very tight remit. And I think it's really important because the labour market is extremely important, and the labour market has not been discussed in relation to the constitutional debate. And this is, it's just really strange, I think, because the labour market is very, very important. The success of any national, regional or local economy is going to be largely dependent on how its labour market functions. And it's also highly relevant to some of the issues that have been at the forefront of the independence campaign. If you think of currency, labour mobility is one of the four most often cited criteria for successful currency union, and yet it's not really discussed as part of that debate. And tax, options for tax policy under various states of constitutional reform are likely to be limited by the degree of integration between the Scottish and UK labour markets. Again, it's not been discussed. And most importantly, from my perspective, in relation to inequality, which is one of the emerging key themes, I think, of the whole debate, we really can't tackle rising inequality at the Scottish level unless we start to tackle some of the increasingly unequal outcomes that we see from our labour market. Scotland, yet these issues are not being discussed, which I really find quite perplexing. If you look at, for example, the Fiscal Commission produced, I think it's a very good and serious report, but it gets to the last chapter, and at one stage it introduces a text box and says, here's all the other policy levers, a phrase I don't really like, I have to say, but here are the policy areas that we could use to advantage in Scotland and to address growth, inequality issues. And at least 20 different policy areas in the labour market doesn't feature. I just find that kind of bizarre. If you're interested in growth, you're interested in inequality, why are we not considering labour market issues? It just doesn't seem right. Yes, at Scottish level, we have a regular and not particularly enlightening debate about labour market statistics, and I could go for Scotland on that. But, when it comes to labour market policy, it really, really features. You think of all the key issues: employment, trade union law, collective bargaining, national minimum wage, discrimination and disadvantage, job quality, tribunal system, active labour market interventions, particularly important at this moment in time, conciliation services. None of these issues have been spoken about to any significant degree by either campaign, by the Scottish Government or by the UK Government. Pensions is probably the only, broadly speaking, labour market issue that has been addressed as part of the debate, but in a pretty unenlightening way. I think it's all been about affordability. It's not been about the system of pensions that whether it's appropriate as to Scotland. And it's important to remember that skills policy is already wholly devolved, so it's kind of reasonable, I think, that doesn't feature in the debate. So I'm going to go and say a few words about the labour market. The labour market's a complex entity. I think we should bear that in mind, so I can't cover everything tonight, and again, happy to come back to anything that you think I've missed during questions. I'd first like to say a wee bit about the Scottish labour market. We hear a lot at the moment, despite the troubles of the last few years. The most recent statistics have been reasonably positive, and always important Scotland, positive relative to the rest of the UK. And we're kind of left with the impression that the labour market's functioning kind of just fine. Well, is it? Well, a wee word about the structure. The labour market, first, as I've already said, highly integrated with the UK. There's a high level of labour mobility between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Contrary to the conventional wisdom, the Scottish labour market is lightly regulated. It's the part of the UK, it's the third most deregulated labour market in the developed world. And as much as we have labour market institutions at all across the UK, these are UK-wide institutions. Think of the national minimum wage. Most of our affiliated trade unions are UK organisations, although I have to stress that the STUC has been wholly independent of the TUC for over 100 years. Employer organisations are UK-wide organisations, ACAS, employment law, all of these cover the whole of the UK. Trade union density and collective bargaining coverage in Scotland are higher than both for the UK as a whole. Density, if not collective bargaining coverage, is higher than the OECD average, but much lower than Europe's most enduringly successful labour markets, and I'll come back on to say a bit about this. In Scotland, as part of the UK, is very rare in Europe, and the degree to which collective bargaining is decentralised. Again, I'll come back to that. So a word about the performance of the labour market. The labour market, I think it's fair to say, is generally regarded as having performed well since devolution. We've got high rates of employment, particularly true before the recession, but as we begin very, very slowly to recover from the recession, we're seeing that being the case again, high relative to the rest of the UK and high by international standards. But the success of the labour market in terms of the headline employment measures, and I have to say, personally, I'm getting really quite sick of a debate about the labour market that just revolves around headline employment, unemployment and inactivity rates that don't really begin to get to the heart of the issue. But the success of the labour market in terms of sustaining high employment levels masks some deeply embedded problems in the Scottish labour market. Long-standing regional and local imbalances, comparatively high levels of low-wage work, the UK rate is second only to the US. High rates of underemployment, the highest in the EU, albeit in quite a narrow definition of what constitutes underemployment. And disadvantages, continues to be experienced by various groups within the labour market, perennial problems that really struggle to address. A key question, I think, is the extent to which seemingly cyclical trends, such as underemployment, falling real wages, rise in self-employment, increasing insecurity is reflected in the greater use of zero-hour contracts, etc. High youth unemployment. Key issue is how will these persist through and beyond the recovery, because it has to be borne in mind that some of these were already apparent prior to the recession kicking in 2008. I think it's important to say that if the aspirations, particularly of the current Scottish Government, of the Yes campaign, for the kind of vision that they're putting forward for an independent Scotland, entirely reasonable vision, these labour market trends will have to be effectively addressed if they want to achieve that vision. I would hope they'd be addressed under any constitutional settlement, but if that vision is to be achieved, it's essential that these areas are tackled, and as I say, they're not being spoken about. So what might constitutional change bring? Well, I think in regard to the labour market, enhanced devolution is just really not that interesting. Given the degree of labour market integration, it's difficult to discern a compelling rationale for devolving significant responsibility for the labour market under enhanced forms of devolution. And indeed, in respect to some of the better proposals and the more detailed proposals, such as Devo Plus, that we've seen coming forward thus far, the labour market is not really featured within them. But independence is an entirely different matter. Although it's entirely possible that a new Scottish Government under independence may seek to do as little as possible to upset the integrated nature of the all-UK labour market, the new government in an independent Scotland may wish to shift towards a model more aligned with the small European nations that it so often references for their better social and economic outcomes. Well, what might this mean? Well, contrary to popular perception, the Nordic labour markets are not heavily regulated, though they're slightly more so than the UK. In Nordic, they have national minimum wages, although minimum wages can be set at a sectoral level through collective bargaining. Instead, the Nordic labour markets are characterised by high trade union density and wide collective bargaining coverage, 92% in Sweden, 90% in Finland, 82% in Denmark, 72% in Norway. Bargaining is coordinated centrally in the case of Finland, or at sectoral level in respect to the other nations. There's massive investment in active labour market programmes. Denmark, for instance, invests more in that area than any other country in the developed world. The other Nordic nations are quite close behind. The UK comes right at the bottom of that table and invests very, very little as a proportion of GDP in active labour market policy. Unemployment insurance is amongst the most generous in the world, significantly more so than the UK. So, I mean, given this, such a different environment, how might Scotland begin to move from A to B? Well, it was interesting, I've said the labour market's not been discussed. The Scottish Government did publish their economic case for independence 3 or 4 weeks ago now, I think, and that began to introduce, quite weakly, with some reticence, I think, some issues around about the labour market, and it did indicate a shift towards more Nordic-style social partnership type thinking. It proposed exploring mechanisms to formalise the relationship between government, employer associations, and what it rather quaintly refers to as employee associations. I think they mean trade unions, but we'll just let them off at that. It's surprising, I think, how little comment this proposal was generated. I've not seen any comment in any of the media at all about this section of the report, which I find quite staggering, because if indeed it does signal a shift towards more centralised formal bargaining mechanisms, and it doesn't say this explicitly, I would have to caveat, it could have a profound impact on the Scottish economy, the labour market and the business models of individual firms. If done well, the impact could be positive socially and economically, but the challenges involved are significant. Why is that the case? Well, I think you look at the OECD, it's argued that national industrial relation structures and practices are part of the social and political fabric, implying that bargaining structures are not easily changed by government action. I think very wise words. I think it's fair to say that a set of societal factors exist in the Nordic nations which enable social partnership to flourish. Similar institutional, cultural and historic factors have led to different, if similarly successful, arrangements in nations such as Germany, Austria and the Netherlands. These conditions do not currently apply in Scotland. What am I thinking about? Well, there's no history of collective bargaining at national or sectoral level in the private sector, or maybe more accurate to say there's no recent history of successful bargaining mechanisms along those lines. Social partners are weak. I think if we're going to talk about social partnership, then we have to be mindful of the state of our social partners. And that's some major challenges for the trade union movement. I would argue that in Scotland, through the STUC, we are better set up than the employer side to engage in social partnership. There is only one trade union confederation in the nation, but the employer side is fragmented. I would argue it's unrepresentative. It's got no analytical capacity whatsoever in Scotland. And although you might expect me to say nasty things about the employer representatives, I would refer you to the recent report by Michael Heseltine undertook in Growth, and a very interesting chapter in there about employer organisations. Now, Heseltine doesn't make the argument in the way that I just done, and he picks his words very carefully, but he does stress that the nature of the way that employer organisations are set up in the UK is detrimental to a good policy development process, and he talks about establishing a more European chamber-style structure across the UK where individual employers will be mandated to join a local chamber, and if that was the case, you would see a very, very different kind of engagement, I think, from the employer community. The way government is set up in Scotland is not conducive to social partnership. Now, we hear an awful... Regularly, ministers talk about social partnership, and that's a good thing. We hear officials talk about it. But in practice, I could bow for Scotland again, with instances of when this has just not been the case. When we meet with Minister X to discuss policy area-wise, and he talks about trade unions being an absolutely central component of how he wants to address future policy development in this area, the whole thing just disintegrates. We wade through TICO, as we often do in these areas with parts of the civil service, and it's just not, what I would describe as real social partnership at all. I think it's just fair to say there's a capacity issue, and when we start raising these things, we get into the Scotland is too wee or too daft type arguments. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying if we were to move towards more formal and genuine styles of social partnership in Scotland, then these are things we've never done. We don't have the whole institutional infrastructure that successful social partnership nations have in sustaining those kind of structures and making them work. So, where do we go from here? Well, I think, if we're talking about social partnership, if we're talking about a different kind of relationship between government, employers and unions, if we're talking about perhaps different modes of collective bargaining, and I would very much like to talk about them, then there's unlikely to be much of a consensus for reform, and it would be good if we could do this on a kind of consensual basis, but the UK's flexible labour market has very widespread political support. The Coalition's current attempts at further significant deregulation are being opposed, but they're they're being opposed in a way that's, again, is quite fragmented and weak, you know, and you don't really hear a strong voice making the case for why, you know, you need a decent level of labour market regulation underpinning the economy. So any initiatives to more heavily regulate or facilitate a more central role for collective bargaining in the Scottish labour market under any constitutional scenario will face stiff resistance. Firms will argue that operating across different employment systems across the UK will introduce expensive new inefficiencies, although some, if not many of them, will already be operating across different jurisdictions with, you know, wildly different kind of employment institutional frameworks. So I think, given the sensitivity, the reticence of participants in the constitutional debate to engage with labour market policy is understandable. But I would argue that if the proportion of low-wage insecure work continues to rise in Scotland, then Scotland condemns itself under any constitutional scenario to a society that's less fair, less equal, less democratic, and to an economy that's more unstable, more prone to systemic crisis. Are we content with a Scottish, with a labour market where too many Scottish workers and firms exist in a low wage, low skill, low productivity equilibrium? I would argue that we shouldn't be content with that at all. So significant change is required. It's incumbent on both sides, I think, to start laying out coherent proposals for change, or arguments at least why the status quo is the best option. They've got nowhere near it so far, and we really need to start talking about it. If we're going to have a debate, I mean, it's interesting how Bed to Rights discussion is framed as a real economy. If we're going to have a real discussion about the real economy, then how people are treated at their work day and daily has to surely become a part of that debate. So I look forward to it start happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for provoking us further. Now, Professor Gordon Hughes.
I'm going to talk this evening about the energy sector, which is a large, both in mental and physical terms, sector in the Scottish economy, and which will be, in a variety of ways, at the core of any prospect for an independent Scotland. Now, let's start with the size of the sector. According to Scottish Government statistics, the gross value added, that's the contribution to GDP, coming from the energy sector in Scotland, is about 15% of Scottish GDP. It varies quite a lot from year to year according to the oil price. But if you add in all of the industries that are dependent on the energy sector, you get to a share of above 20%. Now, on the other side, employment in the energy sector accounts for less than 2% of employment in Scotland. What this tells us is that we have a sector that is very capital intensive. In fact, the energy sector in future projections looks likely to take somewhere between 60 and 80% of all business investment over the next 10 years. So it's hugely important in terms of the investment activities and in terms of its contribution to taxes and to what economists refer to as rents, that is to say, the various forms of income that accrue from the extraction of oil or the exploitation of renewable energy and the like. Now, in order for those numbers to continue, you have to have a large continuing flow of investment. The energy sector is not a matter of simply putting in a lot and leaving it to pump out the oil. You have, in fact, to invest continuously in a whole variety of forms so that what we face is the need to maintain a flow of investment back into the sector. That has a major lesson which has actually been ignored by many countries around the world. Let me give an example, which is the usual reference point that we in Scotland probably compare ourselves to, which is Norway. The crucial feature about Norway is that it has a state-owned oil company, Statoil, and they have ploughed back a very large share of the earnings that come from Statoil into further investment in the company. That is in distinction to, say, Pemex in Mexico or many other companies around the world where that investment has not been made, where the revenues from the energy sector have therefore fallen, and thus there is a consequence in terms of increasing pressure on both the revenues but also on the tax revenues in particular. Now, the reason I make this point is you can't consume what you invest. In other words, a choice has to be made between using the benefits of energy in order to maintain those benefits in future or consuming them today and foregoing what they might earn tomorrow. And that is a crucial issue in terms of a lot of the debate where people talk about, well, the huge bonus we will get to tax revenues from taking over from the UK the Scottish share of North Sea oil and other energy revenues. Yes, we can take it over and we can consume it in a whole variety of ways, varying from high social provision to support of cultural or many, many other good things. But the more you do that, the less you plough into the future, and therefore the lower the incomes will be from this sector in the future. So ultimately, one of the major choices that we face in the energy sector particularly is getting the balance between consumption out of those revenues and investment out of those revenues over the medium and the long term. There's a second issue about energy, which is emphasised if you look at Scotland not as a member of the European Union, but as what it really is if it were to become independent, which is a small, energy-dependent, and rather open, let's say lots of trade, economy. Now, economies of that kind suffer enormously from one major feature of the energy, which is the volatility of prices. All energy prices, like many other commodities, have a tendency to extreme swings, both cyclically and according to external factors of a wide variety of things. The consequence of that is that to the extent that we rely upon energy as a major source of both investment and of consumption, if those price swings work adversely, we will find ourselves severely squeezed. If they work favorably, there's a bonus of a large amount that can be spent. But spending it has a consequence which is widely known by the phrase Dutch disease. Dutch disease is a disease that the Dutch are alleged to have suffered from as a consequence of discovering a lot of gas back in the 1980s. Actually, there are other countries which have suffered much worse, and it is endemic in all energy-dependent countries. The symptoms of the disease are that what happens is that when the times are good, prices of what we call non-traded goods, things that are made at home, consumed at home, are driven up by demand. A lot of that's associated with the fact that if times are good, there's a lot of investment, and so construction prices and lots of other wages and prices go up. That in turn means that the costs for other traded sectors, manufacturing in particular, are higher than they would otherwise be, and by and large they find themselves squeezed. The fate of almost all energy-dependent countries is that the traded goods outside energy essentially get squeezed out. Eventually, they die. And the consequence of that, from the point of view of the Scottish economy, will be a large shock to employment, because employment in manufacturing and other traded goods is much more important than employment in energy or any of the industries and sectors related to that. So one of the problems, therefore, is that the phenomenon of Dutch disease, which is really a consequence of the volatility of energy prices, will essentially very substantially harm the non-energy parts of the economy, which are important, have been important historically, and remain important. An analogy. if you don't know about it, go and find out about the car industry in Australia. Well, the answer is there isn't a car industry in Australia, or at least there isn't going to be. And the reason for that is that mineral booms in Australia have driven up prices to a stage where Australian car manufacturers cannot, even with enormous subsidies, cannot compete with imports coming from Japan or from other parts of the world. And that has been problem for Australia, it's a problem for New Zealand, Canada, Chile, a whole range of countries with essentially the similar characteristics to those that Scotland will have. Now, there's a way around the problem. It's hard to do and is something that is going to pose a large challenge to any independent government. Essentially, the thing you can do is not spend the money. And by not spending the money, the classic solution is you put it in what is generally called a sovereign wealth fund, which is what the Norwegians have done. The Norwegians have actually put the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, somewhere of the order of $1 billion for a small country. Now, they started doing that a long time ago, and actually, Norway's real sovereign wealth is not the sovereign wealth fund, it's Statoil. The biggest of all sources is what they have invested in their oil production infrastructure, and which is owned collectively, in effect. Now, that pattern is one that we do not start from. We neither own the resources, we do not own the infrastructure, and even if we were to start to receive the rents from North Sea oil, we have already committed them to quite a high level in terms of financing all of our public spending of various kinds. So essentially, the choice that would need to be made would be, in effect, a choice of, do we actually build up a sovereign wealth fund? Do we try and stabilise the future of the Scottish economy? Or do we go on financing what we are already paying for today? Now, that's not a choice that I would envy any politician having to make, because it's clearly a very difficult one, but it is the kind of choice that all energy-reliant economies have to make in one form or another. Another point and another issue. We talk about the need, I've referred to the need to maintain investment. If you are not financing the investment yourself, in other words, by ploughing the money back in from your income, what you're going to have to do is have large amounts of flows of capital coming from outside. That's going to mean that we become extremely highly integrated with capital markets around the world. And our ability to operate independent policies, whether it be monetary policy, whether it be fiscal policy or the like, will be heavily constrained by the fact that we will be dependent on maintaining large flows of capital coming in to finance the investment requirements of the energy sector. So what this all means is that the idea that energy, as it were, allows us the freedom to be independent is correct in one sense, but actually it's a freedom that is very, very highly constrained. Because in order to maintain that freedom, we have to pay the price of maintaining the investment and the operation of a sector which is particularly demanding in the way in which it operates. Now, a final thing that I'd like to turn to, and that is the question of markets and the way markets operate. There is an assumption which is entirely understandable, that separation from the United Kingdom will not disrupt the operation of energy markets, whether it be electricity or gas or all kinds of other things. That, to me, seems to be a naive assumption. It's not an assumption that is borne out from the experience of other kinds of separations of countries, or indeed in the way in which independent countries maintain their relationships with each other. Let me give a couple of examples. If the England can no longer rely on gas from the North Sea, is it at all likely that they will simply say, oh, well, we'll carry on importing it, rather than take at least the option on the possibility of importing it from elsewhere or producing from what are quite large reserves of shale gas and the like? The gas is there. The only reason it isn't being produced at the moment is because of resistance to the environmental and other costs. Well, that calculation changes if you are no longer benefiting from direct sovereign control over gas resources. The same is true not just of gas, it's true of renewable energy or other things as well. In effect, the separation of England and Scotland will radically change the calculations in England about the way they operate their energy policies, and we shouldn't assume that we will have the benefits of all of the favourable aspects of the way the policies work at the moment and none of the disadvantages. Actually, England or England and Wales have a lot of options to essentially decide that they did not particularly want to rely on what they may regard as foreign sources of whether it be electricity or gas or energy in general. Since the energy that we have other than oil is actually notably expensive, the use of alternatives other than those within Scotland will actually then severely, potentially hit the revenues that can be earned from renewable energy, from hydropower, or from nuclear power. It's not just from limited sources of it, because we're actually a large exporter of all kinds of electricity to the England and Wales market. So the point here is not that energy is a curse. Sometimes people talk about a resource curse. That's overstatement. It's a great benefit. To Scotland, it would be tremendously important in the future of the Scottish economy. But it needs to be managed in a way that will be different from what we are used to. And in managing it differently from what we're used to, we will have to take this as a perspective of being a very different economy from that of a small region in a large economy that is based on things other than energy. Small energy-dependent countries are different, and they have to manage themselves in a way that reflects that difference. And that represents a challenge which I am far from sure that either side of the debate really understands or acknowledges. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon, and magnificently to time. That leads on to Professor Jeremy Peat.
Thank you, Chairman. Like Brandon, I perhaps should start by saying I'm speaking in a personal capacity. I'm speaking for none of the organisations I'm involved with, nor indeed for the pandas. Alex Salmon tried very hard to get a view out of them when he was visiting us earlier this week. And they wouldn't even tell him if she was pregnant, but there we go. I'm aware that I'm the fourth speaker out of four, and we're all very keen to get on to the question and answer session. And I've been asked to cover a fairly narrow subject, as was Stephen, but I think it's an important one. I want to talk about competition policy and regulation in the context of constitutional change. Now, as our chairman said, I've spent over 8 years on the Competition Commission, and I've dealt with regulatory issues when I was at the Scottish office many years back, and at the RBS, and indeed as a governor and then trustee of the BBC, which must be one of the most difficult organisations to regulate that I've ever come across. And more recently, I've been working on the Scottish Government's plans for competition policy and regulation in preparation for the referendum, and indeed we at the David Hume Institute ran a full conversation of round table, 5 very good papers and a seminar here on this topic. So as a result of all this different involvement, I think I've come up with 3 general principles that I stick to on this subject, and they relate to the real economy. The first is that excessive or inappropriate regulation or indeed unempathetic interpretation and implementation of competition policy can not just be a nuisance to business, but can be a very expensive nuisance to business and to the economy, can lead to the wrong signals, can lead to inefficiencies, and be really quite damaging. However, on the other hand, in the real economy, we need a well-functioning market to stimulate efficiency, and given that no market is of itself perfect, that means we have to have appropriate policies for competition policy and regulation to work towards better functioning markets. So, you've got to get it right. It matters, but it can be dangerous. And to avoid the dangers, we have to appreciate that there is a requirement for very experienced and skilled staff to implement the policies, and the policies have to be very carefully developed, and all decisions have to be taken independently and after thorough analysis and consideration. So this is a tough gig, I would suggest. Now, let me start off by a few words on competition policy itself. Now, we're already seeing at the UK level a major structural change, with the Office of Fair Trading and the Competition Commission being brought together to form the Competition and Markets Authority. Now, Lord David Curry is the chairman-designate of the CMA, and he and the chief executive-designate were in Glasgow a couple of weeks ago. And I'm delighted that they committed to the CMA having a presence in Scotland, which the Competition Commission at the present doesn't have. And I was delighted to hear that. And I think that given increased devolution of policy and practice across the UK, and the fact this devolution will increase in Scotland and is primarily there in Scotland, I think it's absolutely crucial to understand and take account of policy differences in implementing such a UK-wide set of policies. Now, one always gets a bit of stick for this as being the Scottish, the nuisance at these meetings, and I was at a Competition Commission meeting yesterday on the study we're doing of the private health sector, and one of my fellow members of the Commission applauded me for waiting all of 2 hours before I mentioned the fact that the NHS in Scotland was different. I'm still waiting, incidentally, Douglas, to hear the reference to the Secretary of State for the NHS in England on the BBC, or the fact that Michael Gove is Secretary of State for Education in England. One of these days you'll get there, but so I think it's very important that one does point out these differences, and I was very pleased after I got told off for mentioning that 2 of my other colleagues on the team themselves referred to differences in Scotland and Wales in the next half hour. We are getting there in terms of understanding these differences, and it matters for all UK bodies. It matters to understand that there are differences in policies, that these differences matter, and also that the body concerned with implementing policies across the UK has to demonstrate its understanding of the differences and the fact they matter. This is crucial for all bodies at risk of London centricity. So be aware of policy differences, but at the same time, there are difficulties of working towards a wholly separate set of policies and practice on competition policy, because so many markets transcend the boundary between Scotland and the rest of the UK, and would, in my view, transcend those boundaries, certainly for the first decade after an independence referendum, a vote of yes. And it would be neither efficient nor probably effective to undertake separate studies for Scotland and the rest of the UK. In many instances where the Competition Commission or the CMA or the body in Scotland are looking at a sector, and we do sector and market studies unlike any other competition body, or a particular merger or a particular firm and its market dominance. I did a study recently of Booker and Macro and the takeover that was taking place. Now, each market was different, but the same differences applied whether we were talking about East Anglia or Glasgow compared to Edinburgh or wherever. And it made sense to look at that merger across the UK because that's where the 2 companies operated. But it made sense to look at each of their individual markets in order to determine what the effect would be on competition. When one looked at the British Airports Authority, would it have made sense to look at the BAA in Scotland differently from that in England? To an extent, yes, because Glasgow and Edinburgh were very important, but to an extent, no, because the company operated across that space. So I think be aware of the differences, but there are many instances even under independence, where I suspect there would be a need for close cooperation and probably joint working. Now, I know some people get into trouble for saying, well, we'll do things in a similar way as we are doing now and cooperate. But I think in this instance, it's another instance where that is common sense, albeit within a careful context where you're aware of and take account of policy differences. And I suppose the same to an extent applies for regulation. And I'm not going to talk about financial regulation, which I think deserves a separate seminar of its own right. But let me just talk about some of the other sectors. Now, Scotland has demonstrated through the Water Industry Commission for Scotland that it can operate an independent regime very, very successfully. I think WICS has proved itself as a highly efficient regulator, one that is novel in some of its approaches and has been very effective in improving efficiency of the water industry in Scotland. It's very sensible to employ, say, Embiat to set up the body and to run it for its first many years. Ian is as expert in this area as anyone globally. So it chose the high-quality staff, but it developed the right regulatory policies in the context of the Scottish water industry, which was different and was distinct and therefore merited its own regulator. Whether such a regulator is appropriate distinctly for Scotland in other sectors depends. Now, Gordon's just been talking about the electricity market. If there is one electricity market after independence that spans the UK, does one want separate regulators for the bit in Scotland from the bit in the rest of the UK? Would that work? I would suggest that one regulator would work, but one which takes account of the different policies and understands them and brings them in to the decision-making process. On the other hand, there may be totally separate policies and separate markets that would make it sensible to differentiate the regulator in some of the other sectors, for parts of transport, for communications, wherever. So horses for courses. Select what makes sense for the individual circumstance, but at all times have absolute clarity as to policy and practice differences and take account of them in your processes. I want to end up with a brief word on the Scottish Government's current thoughts. Now, there are various papers that I could point you to, but I would say on our website at DHI there's a paper by Martin Cave and John Stern and another one by Ian Osborne, which I think are excellent examinations of the key issues and can provide a far more comprehensive oversight than I can here. But I think the Scottish Government's proposition is perfectly tenable, which is, following independence, to bring together in one body many of the regulation and competition policy functions which at the UK are carried out by diverse bodies. Now, in fact, the UK is going down this route already by bringing OFT and Competition Commission together, and the Scottish Government is looking for economies of scale and scope by bringing a number of bodies under that one umbrella. It can work. New Zealand does that. Netherlands has just established a brand spanking new body which is doing exactly what is proposed. So it can work, and we've demonstrated with WICS that Scotland can run these bodies very effectively. But there are always caveats as to how it be done. First, it has to have the required quality and quantity of highly skilled and, I fear, expensive staff. These are lawyers, always expensive, we know that. Economists, usually dead cheap, but on this occasion some of them are priced, and accountants and the like. And preferably these people have business experience. We don't want people out of academia who don't understand the businesses, because you've got to be empathetic, but you've got to be really skilled in competition and regulatory matters. Some of these people in the new authority will have to be specialists in different sectors, some will have to have the general skills. But it will be also important not to lose the integrity of different elements of the competition and regulation map in bringing people together. Some of these functions interact and interlock, and I can envisage a whole building of Chinese walls being established in order to make this work in the right way. Thirdly, it is absolutely critical that the new body be seen as wholly independent from government. Of course, the conceptual and contextual policies have to be established by government, but then the implementation, the analysis, the judgments have to be wholly separate from government. That is the way we've gone for many years, and that is the way it has to stay. And I do like the approach in the Competition Commission, which is going to be continued in the Competition and Markets Authority, of having independent members So we take responsibility for the decisions. We have excellent staff to do all the hard graft, to have all the skills, but a group of 3, 4 or 5 of us, we are responsible. We're responsible for the decisions, we're responsible for any resulting activities to change matters, and we are responsible for any appeals that come to the Competition Appeals Tribunal or whatever. I think that approach is very sensible, and I think it would be necessary to follow a similar approach in Scotland. And do remember that there will have to be close links with the rest of the UK, as I've already described, but also with Europe, because a lot of policies, so long as we're a member of the European Union, actually transcend the UK, and the EU links are critical. And the degree of separation will be constrained by the extent to which these policies overlap. So, Mr. Chairman, coming to a close, I want to just give you some final thoughts. I want first of all to say that whether under independence or under further devolution, there will be an increasing need to reflect appropriately the Scottish dimension in competition policy and regulation. All involved have to get it. Similarly, either under any policy variant, there will be a need to continue to work in close harmony with the UK, the rest of the UK, and under the constraints of EU policies, and to accept that. More efficiency by aggregation may be feasible, but the technical complexity and the importance to the business environment of these policies and the resource cost of the policies we're talking about should not be underestimated. Finally, though, a perfect market is a wonderful thing to economists. No markets are perfect. Intervention is necessary, but such intervention into markets has to be soundly based, it has to be well argued, and it has to be carefully implemented. For the real economy, competition policy and regulation do matter, and they merit our very careful attention under any constitutional settlement. Thank you very much.
Jeremy, thank you very much indeed. Striking how much more nuanced the debate has been already than you tend to get if you are exposed to Twitter, for instance.
Nothing wrong with Twitter.
I want to hear your questions. There is an overflow room where we can't see or hear you. If you have great needs to ask a question, do please come into the main hall and wave furiously. If you're already in the main hall, please be sure to wave furiously at me to catch my attention. But I'm going to kick off actually to give you partly an opportunity to respond to each other, because you were given slightly different remits and weren't really speaking to each other's remits. So I'm going to give you a bit of an opportunity to do that, and to do it in the context of one of the striking sort of themes that ran through the 4 contributions we've heard. That was that really the real economy, and I note that it was there was very little discussion about what that really means, but the real economy for Scotland is an open economy. We heard, first of all, that independence is an opportunity for promoting Scotland, leveraging Scotland, the brand. We heard about labour market reforms, moving away from the liberalised labour market we have, which raises interesting challenges about the impact there might be on flows of investment and capital, though I'm sure Stephen might also point out that the Nordic examples he gave may be a counter-argument to that. We certainly got a very strong blast of how open the energy markets leave us to trade flows, investment flow volatility. And on regulation, we heard that different regulation can be inefficient and costly. It can be entirely appropriate in some cases. So the real economy is open, it's globalised. And so the question I've got is really to kick off with, as a means of getting you to address each other's arguments, with or without independence for Scotland, is the constitutional debate a way of hiding away from some of these issues of a globalising economy? I'm going to start off, let's just go with the order that we've already spoken in. So I'm going to start with you, Brandon.
Is the debate hiding away from these questions. I don't think so. I think the independence debate is all about globalization. I think globalization is all about levels of interaction, what levels of participation. How are you interacting globally? Are you interacting as a region, as a country within a state, directly, or are you interacting through the UK, through Westminster? So for me, it's all about levels of engagement and how Scotland interacts with the world, and that is the independence debate in a nutshell.
Stephen, take that on if you will.
I think it was certainly one of the SDUC's aspiration that the independence debate would coax out just the very debate you're describing, Douglas. I don't think it's really happened yet, and I think that's a shame. I was in a room yesterday with Jim Mather, the ex-enterprise minister, so I think, after the discussion with Jim, it leads me to quoting books, which of course was Jim's great forte. But I remember reading about 3 years ago now, I think it was published, a book by the great Harvard development economist Danny Roderick, which describes the globalisation trilemma, as he calls it. How do you reconcile global markets, nation states and democracy, which I think is kind of hones in on the great issue of our time, but it's a great issue that's almost completely absent from the Scottish debate, and how Scotland integrates in that global economy tends not to be discussed in any debates about the economy as it is or the economy as it could be in the future. So when certainly we hoped that the independence debate was a way through this, and certainly we'll be doing our best to make sure that Scotland and the global economy is an aspect in that debate. But I mean, again, almost entirely overlooked, I think, by both campaigns thus far.
Gordon, do you want to pick that up?
I think that we are having in places around the world arguments essentially that in European terms are referred to as being about subsidiarity. In other words, what is the right level at which decisions about our future is made? Now, the problem about any of that, it assumes that you have the power to make the decisions, and in a sense, the assumption is that globalization is forcing you down particular routes which may or may not be acceptable within the traditions of a particular culture and political history and the like. And in effect, I approach the question of the independence debate in Scotland as being, what are those things that we want to keep Scottish and in Scotland in terms of control over our futures, and what are the things which either we're happy to pool in some large entity, and in order to achieve the things that we want to retain as being local, do we need independence, or can we do it within a framework of some either current or future, but perhaps different UK?
I'll go to you, Jeremy. I'm not seeing many hands, by the way, so do please wave if you've got questions. Yeah.
I think my answer to your question directly, Douglas, is a qualified yes. I think we are hiding away to an extent. I think that a number of the issues that relate to the real economy, which I am interpreting here about encouraging efficiency through microeconomic policy matters and the like, I think many of those issues are already open to policies within Scotland. As Stephen said, most labour market policies are devolved. Many of the policies for intervention in industry are devolved. There are aspects of energy that are devolved and aspects which may not be able to be devolved, even in independence. So I think the real set of issues that merit our attention under the tag of the real economy or supply side measures or whatever, the debate is very similar whether you're talking about the existing constitutional settlement, the scope for further devolution or a move to independence. I think there are critical issues to discuss, but I think if you're talking about the impact of independence, it's much more on the macro side that one needs to look at the big issues. And on the micro side, I think the issues matter more in the constitutional context.
Okay, let's go to some questions, because we do have hands now. This was the first one I saw. There's a microphone. Bear in mind, with microphones, you're speaking to people who are not in this room, not only in an overspill room, but listening to this because it will be recorded and available afterwards. You might bear that in mind for all sorts of reasons. So yes, if you'd like to kick off first.
My name is Kevin Shaw. As really for Professor Hughes, I heard what you were saying about the Dutch disease, and it struck me as it sounds an awful lot I think of as what has been the UK disease, in the way that the resources in the last 30 years from the North Sea and elsewhere have been squandered by being let to the private sector in totality, and the failure to create a sovereign fund. Now, if we were in an independent Scotland, would that not give us the opportunity to possibly husband these natural resources to us in a much better way than has been done in the last 30 years? Similarly, on the subject of the renewables, without the contribution that Scotland is currently providing, the UK as a whole and England as an independent entity has not a hope of getting anywhere near the targets that have been set by Europe for renewable energies, or in the world stage by the expectations of developed countries to move towards renewable resources. With those things, does that not mean that England is still going to be reliant on buying renewable energy from Scotland in the case of it being independent?
Okay, two big issues around energy. There was a question right at the back, I think, in the back row. Yes? Microphone, if you will, thank you. And introduce yourself.
Yes, it's Rona Brankin. I've got a question for Professor Hughes, please. It's in the oil industry again. Given the potential challenges facing a potentially independent Scotland on decommissioning oil industry, and some of the issues round about, where the boundary is going to be drawn in terms of dividing up the resource, and how Scotland could potentially afford the tax reliefs on decommissioning of the oil industry. If you'd say a few words about that, thanks.
Okay, and so there's one, if we just take one question, this lady here.
Catherine Smith, the interesting thing to me is that the whole debate on the independence of Scotland perhaps arises because we ceased to have a real economy. It seemed to start immediately after the Second World War, and the time for real independence for Scotland might well have been during the 19th century, when we were the manufacturer to the world. Now, given that all of the speakers have indicated that we are talking about the long term, and accepting the reservations about the Dutch disease that Professor Hughes has drawn to our attention, do any of the speakers see any difference between independence and non-independence in regenerating over the long term for our grandchildren a viable Scottish economy such as we had in the great days of engineering?
Okay, well, on the energy question, two of these were specifically put to Gordon Hughes. The others will no doubt want to talk about that. Gordon, this is renewables, whether an independent Scotland also would be better, or perhaps would have been better at husbanding the oil and gas resource that we've got. And there's a specific and horribly technical question, I have to say, about decommissioning, but give it a try anyway.
The first question is, yes, there are common elements to what happened to Britain and what might happen under Dutch disease to Scotland, but it would be much worse in Scotland were this not to be managed well than it was in the whole of the United Kingdom. I think we've got to be a little bit careful, because you conflated the issue of ownership of the resource with how you use the rents that were generated. We chose, for good or ill, probably I agree with you in sympathy for ill, to spend the rents that were being generated rather than to put them aside for future generations. But it doesn't have to be ownership of the resource to ensure that. There were plenty of mechanisms by which the money could have been put aside if we had chose to do that. The problem that I was trying to address is we are where we are. The past is where the past is. Now we've already got used to spending the resource, and if we're going to start to put aside money for the future, it's going to be very difficult to do. The question that was asked about renewables, My warning is don't overestimate your negotiating power. That's to say Scotland's negotiating power over renewables. Your question assumed that we would actually have a market next door where England decided that it was going to honour the EU commitments. I can at least imagine that it decides not to, or more practically, that it decides to go with, for example, nuclear power on a much larger scale, which would meet its carbon targets but not its targets for renewables. There are lots of options, and many, many countries have made mistakes in believing that they have their neighbours in a position where they have a far superior negotiating power. I don't believe that, and it would be very unwise to act on that basis. Finally, just briefly about decommissioning. Decommissioning is a future liability. It's in effect part of the deal that has to be made about the debt. In other words, do we take on the debt? Do we take on the decommissioning liability? And how do we essentially set one off against another? I don't think it's fundamentally a difficult problem so long as you have people who understand what the issue is.
Jeremy, you were shaking your head on that question of whether England would be dependent on the issue of renewables, dependent on Scotland as this Saudi Arabia of renewable power.
Well, I want to very much agree with what Gordon has just said. I mean, Scotland has made the miraculous move up to now of actually requiring the whole of the UK to pay for the cost of subsidising the renewable industry in Scotland. Now, that's been very effective and very successful, and may Scotland get all the benefits from that industry it can. But it is costly, this renewable energy, and there are no signs that it's coming down to competitive costs very quickly. And so England, under an independent settlement, would first of all have to decide, as Gordon said, whether it wishes to continue with the commitment. And if it did, it would say, where do we best get that non-carbon issuing energy from? Where is the cheapest source? And Scotland wouldn't be the only game in town, and Scotland would be quite an expensive game, and so French nuclear might be actually more attractive than Scottish wind. So just be aware of that.
And indeed, sort of Mediterranean solar as well is coming down in cost, and a European-wide market could change things with or without independence as well.
The largest single source of growth in renewables is not wind, it's biomass. And biomass is being imported from the United States and other parts of the world. Actually, the UK could meet all of its targets. It shouldn't, but it could meet all of its targets by basically importing wood.
Stephen, let's go to the final question. I don't know if you want to pick up on the specific energy questions we got there, but this question of with or without independence, regenerating the economy, it comes down to this question of whether government can influence as much as you might like, that the levers of power, for all that they're located either in London or in Edinburgh, actually work.
I think government can certainly influence the economy. Again, the National Economic Forum yesterday, in a really fascinating breakout session, that was the room Jim Mather was in, about innovation. And it was really, I was quite surprised, because usually I have to defend the role of government in the economy, but right across the room, there's a real acceptance that, if you're going to create an effective innovation system, then government has to be at the heart of it. When you look at, America, the home of the free market, why has their innovation system been so successful? Well, NASA, Pentagon, the National Science Endowment, which funded, for instance, the Google algorithm. Now, yes, they've got a highly entrepreneurial society. Yes, they've got a better venture capital framework than we have as well. But government is very much at the heart of that. So yes, I think government. I think the debate in Scotland suffers from the fact the reticence of so many people to accept government as a key stakeholder and player within the economy, a key economic agent, and I think that's very important to accept that. In terms of, I think, if I was hearing you right, you were tying the real economy into the degree of manufacturing within the economy. I think, absolutely, can Scotland over the longer term rebuild a more vibrant manufacturing sector? I think we can. Will independence be crucial there? Probably not. It really depends on the policy mix you settle on under any constitutional scenario. I can understand why some people might think that the fracture created by independence might give you more opportunity to reform the financial system, which would be a prerequisite, I think, for a healthier manufacturing sector. But I think, I think there's nothing inevitable about ongoing manufacturing decline. I've looked at this very closely. I've looked at relative cost bases between countries. And you look at wages per hour in Germany compared to wages per hour in Scotland, still significantly higher, still doing much better. Why are they doing better? The whole system's geared towards the longer term. Well, one kind of pessimistic note I think would hit is even if we do all the right things in terms of policy development, I think that ultimately the jobs dividend is likely to be pretty scant. There's one of the really good emerging debates is about what economists would describe as capital buys technological change, and what journalists would describe as rise of the robots. But I think the degree of mechanisation across the world in manufacturing is really interesting, and the very rapid growth of that mechanisation, even in China, for instance, I think is fascinating. So even if we do all the right things, we could grow manufacturing as a proportion of GDP, unlikely to be a huge jobs dividend, I think.
Brandon, can I pick up on the questions and kind of the strand of the discussion we've had there, specifically on two? You may wish to respond to the other questions that were raised. But one was about whether an independent Scotland could husband the resources, the energy resources that Scotland has and will have into the future better than the UK. I wonder you to respond, if you will, to the point that was made in the presentation by Gordon Hughes, that the money's not available because it's required in order to sustain the level of public services, the level of spending that we've currently got. It's not money that can easily be put aside into a Norwegian-style fund. And the other issue, which I think responds to this issue of regenerating the economy through manufacturing or not, and to the issues you were raising about this leveraging the Scotland, the brand internationally. Where and in which sectors are these companies that are holding off investment or perhaps not being created at all because of the current constitutional position?
Well, to take your first question, I'd just point out I'm the lawyer, not one of the economists. I did mention that at the top. I think in respect of the, and I don't speak for the government or the Yes campaign or the SNP or anybody, but as I understand it, the proposal is that there will be an oil stability fund and that some of the money will be used for that purpose, and that has been worked out. I don't have the detail of that at my fingertips, but I understand that is what the proposal is, and that there will be a stability fund there to absorb economic shocks should they occur in the future. As regards your second point, I don't think I did say that there are certain types of industry or manufacture who are not coming to Scotland because of the current situation. My point was more that, for example...
To clarify, there's something about what you're arguing, that there's economic dynamism that's waiting to be unleashed by this brand which is held back by being within the UK. What is that? Where is that dynamism?
Sure. I mean, I'm using the term brand. It's not a term I would normally use or normally like using. But what I'm saying there is, and I think we've seen it since devolution came to Scotland, since Edinburgh got its parliament back, there has been an increased dynamism in Scotland. There has been life breathed back into the country, and I would see that growing with independence, because if you have independence, if you have a world capital, we see it with London. I mean, London is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Everything comes to London. It's the centre of the world, because that's what government is. And of course, government attracts influence, attracts companies who want to influence government, and it feeds off itself. Now, if we have a world capital in Scotland, in Edinburgh, then we have well, first of all, we have the nations of the world coming to Edinburgh and establishing embassies, not just the few consulates we have just now. We have companies basing themselves in Scotland. They may have to base themselves in Scotland for certain purposes. In terms of what you're talking about, in terms of what is not happening, I was referring specifically to an area where I operate, which is international arbitration, for example. Where in Scotland we really haven't got very much of it. Companies tend to go through London for that. We're trying to develop that in Scotland and build that in Scotland. And it is, in fairness, it would be possible to build that to an extent without independence. We hope to build it regardless of what happens. Things like bilateral investment treaties and treaty arbitration that comes out of that, and the economic benefit of that, which is huge to London. I mean, the benefit of the legal sector in London and the international law firms that set up there and operate from there is massive. That is, that's the kind of thing we're trying to do with the International Centre for Energy Arbitration, of which I'm a co-director. We're trying to attract that. But realistically, countries deal with their own international treaty arbitration. We don't have international treaties because we don't treat. We have no capacity to treat. We have no international legal personality, and therefore we don't get involved in any of that.
Douglas, can I just, a brief word, if I may? I mean, on that point about what could be different, I mean, I think, taking slight issue with Stephen, so far as innovation is concerned, I don't see any separate policies or differences that could come about with independence that essentially aren't there at the moment. And it's been one of the staggering conundrums of Scotland for the last 30 years, that Scotland has been brilliant at creating intellectual capital through its excellent research institutions and elsewhere, and pretty rubbish at utilising it. Now that is scary. I mean, Edinburgh, Strathclyde, St Andrews, Aberdeen, Dundee, excellent at creating intellectual capital. But we are at the bottom of the league table in terms of utilising it, certainly so far as domestic businesses are concerned. And I don't see what with independence changes that. I'm sure Jim Mather did a mind map for you, but I'm not sure what came at the end of it.
There was no mind maps.
There was no mind map, that's a first.
It wasn't cheering.
But just to take it on from there to what Brendan was saying, I think the interesting issue is whether something happens to change the psyche. Our old friend animal spirits, Douglas. Do animal spirits come into play in any way as they did for a period in Ireland? And is there anything there that is going to lead a difference in the way things happen, which is not policy related, not government related, but related to people generally and the way they operate? That, I think, is a fascinating question.
There's a question down here. I don't see any other hands, so please, yes, I do now. Okay, so starting here.
Yeah, do the decisions here not... Sorry, my name is Barry Hannaford, and what I'm really wanting to look at is the more broad span. Surely the decisions on the real economy, like any political decisions, come down to two things: competence and intent. Now, everyone, I would imagine, is pro-competence. The more efficient we are, the better we are at utilising our economic inventions and things. No one's going to argue. No one's going to say there's one way to do it or that, but everyone wants to do it the right way. The key question, surely, is intent, and that's to do with why you're doing it, and that's the whole direction in which you point your economy. We've had 35 years of growing inequality in the UK. Inequality between the rich and the poor, inequality between London and the other regions. A report today said that the richest households in Scotland are 273 times wealthier than the poorer ones. Now, while you are pro-efficiency, surely what's to do is what you're trying to do. Whether you're trying to generate income for the already enriched elite and the people within London, and if you look at this government opposing all European moves to limit bankers' bonuses even to 2 years of their annual salary, I would argue that's the intent of the current Westminster government. And the alternative to that, I would hope, is to have a Scottish government with the intent, albeit subject to its own competence, of enriching the broader population and people of Scotland. Surely that's the real choice.
A couple more questions up at the end of that row, if you will. Thank you very much indeed, sir. And I think there was a third question down here, was that right? Did I see a hand earlier? Just here, sir. Yeah.
John Bretton. First of all, I'd like to thank the Royal Society for hosting this series of lectures. I've worked in Canada for 20 years and I've relocated to Scotland. And my question is linked to the lecture we had last month around defence and trying to link that to the topic this evening of the real economy. And I think there's a lot of different levels of complexity around the term real economy. 12 months ago, The Guardian, in an editorial, made a statement that it's taboo to discuss the expenditure on Trident. And in this age of austerity, there's been no discussion about whether the UK can afford either maintaining Trident or its replacement. Even last week in the debate around expenditure, Ed Miliband talked about applying a razor focus on every pound they spent. Well, presumably, there's going to be no razor focus on the expenditure on Trident. This is my question to the panel. Given that it's estimated that the removal of Trident and non-participation in the UK's future nuclear strike force would save something in the region of £2.2 billion between 2010 and 2030. It's about 110 million pounds per year. If there was a vote for yes, would the panel wish to comment on whether or how they would advise an independent Scottish government how they would use those savings in terms of rebalancing the economy, and referring to a paper that I read from Professor Pete, restoring confidence in the economy? How would they, or what would they recommend to a Scottish government on using the £110 million per year for the next 15 years?
And if you've got a microphone there, if you can bring it just down here to this gentleman here. We'll take answers after that.
Thank you. My name's Peter Upton, and I possibly represent some of those of us who are not educated in economic affairs and so on, so some of the more technical terms are a little bit fuzzy for me. But I just really wanted to know if you could explain more clearly what the real economy is as opposed to any other kind. What other economies are there?
I was rather hoping that my introductory comments might have provoked an answer to that one, and I failed miserably, but perhaps your question will get them to reconsider what the real economy is. Stephen, do you want to kick off with that? The other issues, I think are around issues of intent and how money could be differently spent. The extent, particularly on Trident, the extent to which it is a sort of panacea. You get £110 million per year. It seems to get committed to an awful lot of different things. Stephen, go for it.
Absolutely. What is the real economy? I don't know. I mean, it wasn't me who decided on the name for this evening. I do get frustrated. I mean, there's no greater supporters of manufacturing economy in the STC. I mean, we've published quite extensively on this, and we've taken this to all our big meetings with senior government ministers over the last few years, trying to generate an effective debate about how we can boost manufacturing. But I do get frustrated when we describe manufacturing as real and everything else is kind of unreal. I mean, there's real people working in real jobs in these unreal sectors of the economy, so I do get kind of a bit frustrated by that. On the Trident issue, I mean, it's, some of us have been speaking about this issue for a very long time. The STC got a long-standing principled position against nuclear weapons. We published a paper on diversification a few years back with Scottish CND. I would say one thing, I mean, the money to do with Trident is kind of neither here nor there when it comes to rebalancing the public finances. The sums sound vast in terms of the annual deficit at the moment. It's not a great amount, but in terms of what I would do with it, well, I would use it to try and help address what I regard as Scotland's greatest structural problem in the economy, and that is the failure of the financial sector to support productive growing businesses with patient committed capital. So in the first instance, I would bank some money towards the Scottish Investment Bank. Jeremy will tell me if I'm unable to do that. The various innovation funds that Scottish Enterprise also control, give some money there. I mean, I would want this money spent in ways that would help boost the productive side of the Scottish economy. Can I very quickly cover inequality if I've got time?
Yep.
I mean, I think the point's very well made. And again, the Scottish Government's case for economic case for independence started to talk about inequality. The Fiscal Commission report started to talk about inequality, but again, in a quite insufficient way, I would argue. There's no serious consideration out there about why inequality has grown and what can be done under various constitutional scenarios to try and help address that. I would certainly encourage people to get beyond the usual explanations of skill-based technological change plus trade. I mean, these don't begin to help explain the US and UK exceptionalism here, where performance has been much worse than other places. I think we need to start turning towards a norms and institutions type explanation to that, which opens up a whole new debate, which I'm sure Douglas will not allow me time to start covering.
You're dead right, I won't. Gordon, take that on, if you will. The question of inequality, for instance, from an economist's point of view, to some extent, global forces drive inequality. It's not a choice that's actively made by governments. The choice is what you do about the global forces, isn't it?
I think I'd like to tie that to the question about what is the real economy. The real economy is sometimes interpreted as being about goods, making things. I would actually interpret it in a slightly different way, which is of coming to terms with the real economy. That is to say, the way things are in the world, which is where the issue of globalization arises. Because the thing that is characteristic of all economies over the last 20, 30 years is that their freedom of choice is much, much less than we would like to believe or than we are frequently told by politicians and by others. The extent to which you can really change things, and certainly change things quickly, is very, very difficult in a world in particular where you are dependent on capital and skills that are highly mobile. And they are increasingly mobile, and Scotland as a country, as I have said, will be very subject to ease of migration of both. And that means that what we do, whether it is about your concerns about inequality or in various other areas, have always to be weighed against the fact that we cannot expect that just because we're Scotland and we're independent, that we have a right to keep people, to keep capital, rather than providing an environment that is attractive for those people and for the capital. That's an incredibly difficult thing to balance, as many, many countries around the world have found over the last 20 years.
Jeremy, take that on as our other economist here.
Well, the real economy to me is what happens out there, the production, the distribution. It's not these fancy transfers that are taking place in strange ways that no one really understands what they're all about. It's actually what is happening in production and distribution. And I think that is what matters. I think to pick up another couple of the points there, I very much agree with Barry that intent matters. I think that I use this technical phrase, so apologies, that Scotland should know what its objective function is. What do we want to achieve? What trade-off would we accept between more equality and perhaps slower growth? What is our priority? How do we balance our priorities? And if you know that, if you have a view on that, you can then start to think which policies would work the best way to achieve those ends. Now, we never actually discuss that because it's far too difficult for any politician to hammer his colours to that particular mast. But when we're talking about welfare policies, it is important to know what matters. When we're talking about universal benefits, with their perverse impacts on redistribution, actually most of them are irrational in terms of aiming at more equality. One needs to know what the objectives of government are, and it is quite conceivable for an independent Scotland to have a different pattern of objectives from the UK as is or might be. So I think it is important to know, and I think we should continue to seek to get that, but actually getting explicit statements may be very difficult. The last point is on Trident. Yes, it's a trivial amount in strange ways, and we are already overcommitted, but I agree with Stephen that it would be great to get more investment going into the private sector, the productive sector of our economy. My worry is that the problem is much more demand for funds for investment than supply of funds, because confidence is weak, businesses aren't wanting to expand their capacity or to enhance and improve their capacity because they're worried that they're tight, they're broken, the markets are difficult. So pumping more capital out there through a government back may not be the answer. The real answer is to get confidence, to get movement, and that's where we're back to the international markets and the difficulties that we face.
Okay, we are running tight for time. This is usually the point at which everybody puts their hands up when it's really too late. But do let's see your hands if you've got questions before. We'll come to them as soon as we've heard from Brandon. Issues there, perhaps I don't know if you want to comment on that trade-off that may be disputed between maximising growth and tackling inequality. How Scotland might deal with that trade-off, and also this question about prioritising spending if you get money from not having Trident, or indeed how radical you could be with reshaping the Scottish budget.
Yes, again, lawyer, not economist, but I think if you had that kind of money to play with, I think it appears to be received wisdom that getting rid of inequality or reducing inequality boosts the economy, helps the economy. How you address that, the mechanics of how you address that, I don't know. Certainly think a priority from my point of view. It's not just inequality, obviously. If everyone is making £100,000 a year and the best, richest people are making 200 times that, that's perhaps not such a problem. It's child poverty, for example, and going that way, record levels of child poverty that we have. I'm concerned about how we address that. I don't know how you address that in terms of welfare policy. I'm not an expert in that field, but in terms of priorities, I would hope that instead of spending £110 million a year on Trident, we could look at addressing, for example, child poverty.
Okay. The question from gentleman up at the back there. These will have to be fairly brief.
Ron McQuaid. We've spoken about globalisation, but I just wondered whether your views on whether independent Scotland will be better or less able to effectively deal with other big changes, some of which we know are going to happen, such as the ageing of the population structure, but other ones may be more speculative, such as the deflation of the debt budget, global debt, perhaps leading to another crisis in the stock market, or even things like a massive terrorist attack on other parts of the UK. So how well would it be able to respond to these big shocks that some of which we know are coming and some of which may or may not come?
Okay, there's a question at the back there as well.
Linda Somerville. The financial services sector in Scotland has been described under the previous Scottish Executive as the backbone of the Scottish economy, and even now under our Scottish Government is still seen as a key economic sector, although its growth is not nearly as rapid as it once was. And I wonder what the panel would like to offer as suggestions that under independence, how the financial services sector could be restructured to ensure that it contributes effectively to the Scottish economy.
And I think a final question down here.
Jim Gallagher. My question is a little similar in a sense. It's about markets. We've seen in the presentations references constantly to the fact that Scotland participates in UK markets at present. UK markets for labour, UK markets that are regulated, UK energy market. Does putting an international border across such a market make a difference to it?
Okay, let's start with Gordon Hughes on that. And to some extent that touches on the issues of regulation that we'd heard a bit about from Jeremy earlier on. Gordon, take that on if you will.
Yes, it does. It's surprising the extent to which it does, but if you look around the world, countries which have split up or countries which are separated by borders which would seem otherwise to be well integrated do much less trade with one another than similar regions within a country. So for reasons that we don't entirely understand, borders matter. And they matter in terms of the integration of economic activity. Can I just pick up the issue of shocks that was raised as well? If you're a small country, shocks are a big deal. And you have to be correspondingly more flexible in order to cope with those shocks, whether they be economic or whether they be other respects. I think that we have then, as an independent country, to find ways by which we build that flexibility into our institutions in terms of responding to things in the outside world that we have less control over and which are not buffered in a larger economy. So the capacity for flexibility will be increasingly important if you want to go your own way.
Several issues which are, I think, a challenge to your point of view, Brandon.
Yes, again, mostly economics-based, but that's okay. In terms of dealing with shocks, I mean, there are, of course, plenty of countries around the world of Scotland's size with far less in the way of prosperity, certainly far less in the way of natural resources. And I guess we would deal with these shocks in the same way that they do, hopefully better. Certainly, I think in terms of what we've been through, we would certainly need to look ahead to how we would respond to a similar situation and prepare and try our best not to let that happen again. Certainly I made reference to a stability fund and one would hope that an oil stability fund could assist in a situation like that, and that would clearly be an advantage that would Scotland have over nations that don't have our natural resources. In terms of the, what was the next point? The border point? Was that the second?
Yes, but borders, I think the argument is that borders create problems, issues, challenges, maybe you'd argue opportunities.
Well, I mean, the border that is currently troubling my mind most is the border that would come up between us and the 500 million consumers in the European Union, if we're going to be leaving that in the event that follows a no vote. I'm as concerned about, shall we say. I don't know. I mean, yes, there will be a border. It won't be a border post by any manner of means. There will continue to be, I'm sure, very high levels of integration in markets and economies. I have to defer to the economists. I'm not going to pretend I know more than them about how these things work in practice. But I don't expect that the rest of the UK is going to stop buying Scottish products. I mean, I saw I think it was Simon Howie, the butcher, today in the papers, talking about how he expected to continue selling regardless of what the constitutional outcome came at similar levels, because in his view it was about quality and price and not about borders.
And he is a maker of haggis, it should be said. Jeremy, there was a question about the financial sector there you might want to take on as a man who knows something about that. And I want also to add to that issue about borders, something that particularly interests me. It's London. We've heard a bit about London from various people here, that Edinburgh could be a world capital. Well, London is already a world capital, and with or without a border, it's going to influence us. I'm fascinated by the magnetic power of London for resource, but also the dynamic power of London, even for an independent Scotland, would continue to be a very important source of economic drive.
Well, London is distinct, unique, whatever you like to call it, and it has a huge impact, not just across the UK, but across Europe. It is a great centre that does attract around it, and working against that is very difficult. We had a period in Scotland where, with the two great banks, when they were two great banks, one actually was able to attract high-quality lawyers, accountants, and other professional services around them, and one was developing a centre there. Sadly, since their demise, and I left RBS in 2005, I should point out, rather than 2008 as it did. So it wasn't
very
really,
important distinction.
It was a big boy who did it and ran away. I think that we now will not compete with London as that type of centre. We have to be a different centre. And I think for our financial services, what is quite remarkable is how the Scottish financial service sector has flourished in Edinburgh and Glasgow and to an extent Aberdeen, despite the two banks' utter debacle. I think that success is something we should be really proud of. And I think the question of how we restructure financial services is we continue as we are, because a lot of the elements of financial services that are successful should continue to be so, provided we give a degree of certainty about the regime that will operate. The uncertainties are what will cause those bits that are still flourishing to flourish less. Likewise, with Jim's question about borders, it is uncertainties which will cause problems across borders. The more there are risks of a change in the environment, the more those borders will matter. So not only differences, but potential differences matter, and therefore borders do matter. If I could just make one brief comment on the global impacts, and I agree with what Gordon was saying about flexibility. And it's been interesting, there's some work done by Professor David Skilling, a very good New Zealand economist, has pointed out how a number of small, flexible economies have been very, very successful in the global economy and have worked against shocks. But what's interesting is that each of them have run very tight monetary and fiscal policies. And very strong exchange rates in that. So what they've done is high interest rates relative to their peer group, low deficits or surpluses on their fiscal side, and they need that to be effective as small economies. Now, Scotland, if it wishes to go down that route, has to be more flexible, but it also has to be more tight, which may make an oil fund even more difficult than others have suggested.
Stephen, lots of strands to pick up on there, and one that we haven't picked up on was a question about the you could say it's yet another elephant in the room, the ageing population, demographic change. I don't know if you want to pick up on that too.
I think it's very interesting because it's directly related, I think, to the shocks question. You know, a question that I think there's almost too many uncertainties to answer with any great certainty, I suppose. But I mean, I think, you know, a time where we don't know what the macroeconomic framework's going to be, we don't know the division of assets and liabilities. You know, trying to cast forward and, you know, trying to define Scotland's ability to cope with it, to absorb these shocks, I think is very difficult. But, you know, demographics is an interesting one. Now, Scotland is generally regarded as having a worse demographic profile than the rest of the UK. But the reason why that's the case is because immigration is predicted to grow much more quickly across the UK. Now, it's entirely plausible, I think, under independence, if Scotland runs a different kind of regime, that immigration could be higher in Scotland, and therefore that demographic problem takes care of itself. I'm not saying that will happen, but it's entirely possible. I think it's also related to the issue I was trying to talk about, and I got into my wee paper for the David Hume Institute last year, but what the economist William Baumol identified in the 1960s, the cost disease, you know, the fact that the cost of public services, because the labour-intensive public services will always rise at a faster pace than the dynamic part of the economy, which, you know, the manufacturing sector. It's not a public-private issue, but, you know, I think it's something we need to realise. I've just finished reading Baumol's new book, which is incredibly optimistic, actually, and he's saying the cost of public services is going to rise by X amount. It's, you know, frightening when you look at the graphs, but you look at the productivity increases across the rest of the economy, they're even greater. So actually we're creating a wealth that will allow us to pay for those public services. And what Baumol identifies as the greater problem is the falling costs of things we should really worry about, like weapons and drugs and things like that, you know, and it puts the whole debate in a completely different footing. And I wish it's, again, something we don't talk about in Scotland. I wish we'd address the, you know, the cost of public services debate from that angle. If I can quickly touch on financial services,
very quickly,
I think it's very interesting. Again, I mean, the degree of flexibility that Scotland will have to implement significant reform is going to be related to the macroeconomic framework. And it's not clear to me that under the proposals of the Fiscal Commission, Scotland will have the flexibility to do anything particularly new or different in this area. Yeah, and absolutely Europe as well. I think the lesson we've learned, the one I'll leave on, is pursuing growth in banking in and of itself as an ultimate aim. I think we've all learned the dangers of that. Other aspects, other parts of the financial services sector, yes, continue to treat it as a priority sector under the government's economic plan. I'm not so convinced that banking should continue to be a part of that. And I'm just going to skip the borders issue altogether because it's much too difficult.
It's one of many issues which will continue. We have Well, it's now just less than 15 months to continue this conversation, so we'll have to pack a lot into that, it seems. I'm not going to try to draw these strands together just now, but it may be that Professor Jim Gallagher of Glasgow University might be able to do a bit of that for us.
Was I?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm rather hoping you will.
Vote of thanks. Vote of thanks. You've got to say thank you.
Thanks very much, Douglas. This was expected, after all. Well, first of all, there is no possibility of drawing very particular conclusions from such a broad and actually very rich debate. But it does, I think, emphasise the importance of that thing, the real economy. And I take the blame for this phrase, the real economy, because far too much of the debate so far in the year we've had already of the constitutional debate on the economic side has been about rather abstract things, about currencies and about fiscal balances and about tax and spend. But as Jeremy Peat said, in the end, what matters is production and distribution, or as Stephen put it, real people doing real jobs in real places. And the important issue that will face us all when we make the choice that we're going to make in 15 months' time, the polls tell us the important issue for most of us is what it will mean for our economy. Because, of course, it's an issue of the day. It's always an issue of the day. Brandon, however, is right to say that this is not just a pocketbook question. It's a choice about identity. It's a choice about belonging. But like all choices, it will benefit greatly from reflection and information. And what we've heard today has been both of those things. We've learnt things we didn't know. We've learnt some fancy economic words we never heard of, and I've written some of them down. And we've learnt that people do reflect carefully on these issues, as our speakers have today. In the remaining 15 months, until the referendum day, I hope that all the debates we have will be equally thoughtful, equally informative, and equally good-humoured, as we've seen this evening. And I hope that all the audiences at these debates will be as lively and interested as you have been, and you people in the faraway room away back over there. I'm going to invite you to thank the whole panel in a moment, but before you do that, save up your applause for a minute, because Sir John Arbuthnot, the President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, is going to say a final closing word.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I won't detain you. Thank you as an audience for listening intently, for taking part very thoughtfully in the questions. Thank you to the panel for their presentations. We've learned a lot. We've learned that Brandon is not an economist. And more than that, I think there's a lot of us here who are not economists. And can I just say, this is difficult stuff. What we've heard here this evening are discussions about really complex issues to do with the life and times that lie ahead of us, whether we become independent or not. And that is the function that I wanted these debates to achieve, because they will be an archive, they will be a chronicle of the things that at least should have been discussed in great detail before we actually come to vote. So I'm proud of what we're doing in that regard. Particularly this evening, Douglas, thank you for your expert chairmanship of this panel. Thanks to the panel for their informative contributions. Jim Gallagher is the man who convinced our little committee that the real economy was a real thing, and I think it is. Thank you, Jim.